hope it is visible now. And so what I was saying is that I'm not now explaining the block diagram of a machine learning model. So any object or a phenomena is represented by something called a feature vector or input vector denoted by X. So this could be like the pixels of a face image, or maybe the attributes which are important to characterize a bank loan customer, things like that, usually done by domain experts. But this is usually possible if you have a structured data. For example, if you have a credit card, a table-like data, a spreadsheet-like data, then there are a few columns, you can easily understand it. But if you have unstructured data, say for example, face or a music or a speech, it's difficult for even for a domain expert to tell what is that exactly in the data that would be helping to the machine learning. So there comes deep learning, which kind of just deals with the tasks that the learning algorithm is entrusted to do. And based on the tasks, it would find out what is the best representation automatically, almost automatically. So that's the difference between classical machine learning and deep learning. So that's because this finding out representation is difficult for unstructured data. Deep learning is usually more popular for unstructured data. I'd like to tell some terminology. So it says this is a vector. In fact, there can be other representations also beside vector. There can be graphs, there can be sequences, there can be other complex objects by which an object can be represented. But let's start with, let's say, a vector representation. This vector, since you can treat a vector, let's say an n-dimensional vector, as a point in an n-dimensional space, where each component of the vector is a coordinate axis, this x is also sometimes called a data point. So I interchangeably use these terms: a data point, an input vector, a feature vector, an attribute vector. These are all equivalent. I'll interchangeably use them. And then you have what is called a set of data, which is kind of the experience or the training data on which you use to build your learning model. So this training data would not only contain the input vectors, it would sometimes also contain what the machine learning system's output should be if this was the input. What is the desired output that should be if this was the input? So you also know a desired output. So such pairs, in certain cases such pairs are, there is nothing called a predefined desired output. In that case, of course, your training data would consist of only the input vectors. And then using this training data, you come up with a mathematical model called a learning model. And what this learning model would do after the training is over, it would take as input x and produce an output y. For example, it would take a feature vector corresponding to a face image, and output would be whether this face is a particular person's face. Okay, somebody's face, say Jack Ma's face or somebody's face. Okay, so you can think of this learning model as some kind of function fx which converts x to y. Besides that, we have something called an error function, which measures how good this learning model is. It basically measures the difference between what the actual output should have been with the predicted output by the learning model. So it's kind of the difference between y and fx. This difference may be fx minus y whole square log of fx minus y, something can be anything, which we call as the error function. And what this learning algorithm does is that this learning model is often, they often take the shape of they are often like classes. So you have certain learning models where fx would be a straight line, a linear model, where fx would be a neural network, where fx would be a decision tree. So fx can vary. And suppose we are considering all the linear models, the individual different f1x, f2x, f3x would be characterized by a set of parameters. For example, if it is a linear model, each line would be characterized by the slope and the intercept of the line. So this would be called the parameters of the learning. And what this learning algorithm will do, it will solve an optimization problem. It will find out the parameters of the learning model such that the learning model with that particular parameter has the minimum error with respect to the desired output. Okay, because the predicted output effects would depend on the parameters of the learning model, and you come up with the best parameters such that fx is as close to the desired output y as possible. That's what the learning algorithm does. So basically, we have two things to take care of. First of all, we need some training data. First of all, we need some representation, and even before that, we need what is the desired output, what is the tasks, and so on. How do you represent a problem? And once you have that, you need a training data. And using the training data, you first train your model, build your model. Once you build the model, then it's done. In future, when a new input comes, you can use that learned model or trained model to predict the output. So this is what any machine learning algorithm would just mean a variation in the error function or variation in effects or variation in training data and so on. Okay, so there are some, depending on what category or what type of function this fx is, we have the following categories of machine learning models. We have a classification model where output y is a category or a group, and they are predefined. For example, I am doing a email spam classification. You know the output is only two outputs, possible outputs. It can be a spam or non-spam. This is a binary classification problem. Or I have a news article as an input. I want to classify whether it is a political news or a sports news or a entertainment news. So I have, say, 5 classes like that. But the point to be noted is that these classes are predefined. You know, every input will belong to at least one of these classes. So in the classification problem, since output is a category, a finite number of predefined categories, we can sort of map them to integers. So if you have k categories, you can map them to integers output. You can think of the output as integers 1 to k. Well, 1 corresponds to, let's say, sports news, 2 corresponds to political news, and so on. When the output is not an integer, but rather a real valued number, then we call it a regression. For example, the value of a stock, say how many rupees, or this is the value, or how many you put up an advertisement in the internet, you want to predict how many clicks will be there in the advertisement. Okay. So these are not predefined set of categories. These are values. Okay. The values, so for example, in the number of clicks, the values are not necessarily floating point. There will also be integers. But the difference is we can think of them as continuous values. Okay, or for example, predicting the rainfall that will be there tomorrow. It's a continuous value. So there's a call as a regression problem. These two categories, classification and regression, these are like, given an input, you want to predict what the output should be. So given an, let's say, face image, I want to predict whether this belongs to a particular person. Given an email, I want to predict if it is spam or not. Similarly, in regression, given some parameters of a stock, I want to predict what its value will be tomorrow. So these are sometimes called predictive analytics or predictive machine learning. Sometimes one of the requirements for predictive machine learning is that you kind of know that you want to predict the output. You kind of expect that this output can be something. Either this will be this class or this will be this PL value. You can expect it. Whereas in alternately, there is no notion of a desired output. This should be the prediction. This is what you are likely to do. You rather want to find out groups or patterns in the data. Okay, then it would be called a explorative analysis or clustering in more common terms. Okay, so clustering is one type of exploratory analytics where you just group your objects into homogeneous groups. Okay, you don't have any predefined categories; you just form homogeneous. And you can have like the complement of this. You find out data points which do not belong to any homogeneous group. They are outliers. They are anomalies. Okay, so this kind of exploratory analysis is also, for example, you are doing a market segmentation of, say, all the customers of, let's say, Big Bazaar. You really don't know that, you don't know the category. You want to explore what are the categories, what are the groups, what are the buying behavior, common buying behaviors. Or say you have an industrial plant, you want to really detect whether something which is an outlier, something which is an anomaly that is happening somewhere in the plant. You cannot predefine because anomaly is something which is unexpected, which is beyond existing patterns. Okay, so you don't have you don't have a predefined output in mind. You are rather exploring that. So this is called exploratory or cluster. So depending on depending on what your training data looks like, you can have a supervised training data where given not only X, the input is given, the corresponding Y is also given. So you give a face and tell this face belongs to Jack Ma. Or you give a stock parameter, you know this stock parameter's value will be, historically its value was this in the next step. So you have this output is sometimes called the label or ground truth or annotation. Often this is available from previous history. If this is available, as if there is somebody who is supervising the learning process, we call it as a supervised learning, which is same as the predictive data analysis we talked about earlier. And if this is not available, then we call it as an unsupervised learning, which is equivalent to the explorative data analysis that we talked about earlier. You can have a mixture of these two. You can have a training set in which some of the data points are labeled and some of them are not labeled. Usually, since labeling is costly, it requires human intervention, you have less amount of supervised data. Supervised data is usually rarer, and you have lots of unsupervised. And such a situation would be called semi-supervised learning. Okay, so now let's come to some of the effects of the functions that we can use to in the machine learning models. So if you are doing if your output is classification or regression, either of these two. In fact, it's easy to see that you can easily convert a regression algorithm into classification regression algorithm. There are a lot of. I've just listed a few. There can be logistic regression, Bayesian learning, k-nearest neighbor decision trees, support vector machines, boosting algorithms, neural network, and deep learning. Similarly, for clustering, you can have k-means clustering, hierarchical clustering, DB-scan. So what we will do, I have highlighted some of them because of two reasons. First of all, these are very widely used. Secondly, some of these are time consuming for large data, so we will see how we can accelerate them. And what we'll do, in fact, is that we will demonstrate in our hands-on session how we code these algorithms in the data. Okay, so let us keep this picture in your mind throughout this lecture. In fact, beyond that also. So we have a learning model fx which converts x to y, and the parameters of this model are obtained using the learning algorithm. So what's the simplest fx you can think of? Simplest fx you can think of, y is a linear function of x. By the way, this x is I'm writing as a single bit. It actually means a vector. It actually means a vector. Okay, it can be a one-dimensional vector, but it is a vector. So the simplest model you can think of is a kind of a straight line, which we call is a linear regression. Okay, So y is nothing but a linear. So in general, the prediction model will be like this: y equal to f of x, the input, and beta, the parameters of the model. Let's call them beta. Usually, what happens is that, see, these are all machine learning models are kind of approximations of that. It's more often than not, it doesn't exactly match the output. Okay, so it's not an exact deterministic model. So always your output is some function of the input plus some uncertainty. It's almost fx, but there may be a little bit difference from fx in the actual situation. This is what we call an epsilon or a residual. This is the part of y that cannot be modeled using f. It's the residual. And the simplest thing that we can think of about fx is it's a straight line. It's beta naught. Beta naught is the intercept, and beta 1 times x. Here again, x is, I have shown it as a scalar, just for if you can see it, but this x can be a vector. So this beta can be a vector, beta 1 can be a vector also. Okay, so it's the simplest regression model, linear regression model. So you can take example. For example, say let's say x, I'm considering univariate one variable only. It's number of hours a student have studied, and y is, let's say, the marks she gets in an exam. So this can be a linear regression. The more you study, the more marks you will get in exam. But of course, it is not exactly a linear model. Some people study the same amount of hours, but one gets less mark, one gets more marks. So this kind of residual should always be there. Because the number of hours you study will not completely model your marks you get. So there's a residual there. So that's the deviation from this blue line. Okay, so what does your training data consist of? It consists of a bunch of x and the corresponding values of y. This red points. It's basically an xy coordinates. And what you do, you may define the error of a point as being y minus f of x. That's you can think of this as a vertical line drop from this red point to the blue line. That's the error from that point. You take the square of that and add up the error over all the points, you get the sum square. Now you can easily find, you can in fact just by simple calculation, you can find out the values of beta naught and beta 1, which means you are tilting the line or shifting the line, so that this error is the smallest among all possible lines. Okay, so that's the training. That's the simple training process in this case. Sometimes when you have more parameters or more complex function, training it would be not so simple. It would require more effort. Okay, now let's change the problem. So this is a regression problem because output is marks, which is kind of continuous. Now let's say I am not interested in what marks he gets. Instead, I am just interested in whether she will pass or fail. Okay, so I have recordings of many students and how many hours they studied per week, followed by 0 if they fail, 1 if they pass. And I want my model to predict, taking as input number of hours, whether the output is 0 or 1, pass or fail. How do I do that? It's not possible in this regression because it outputs an real value. So how do you change that? One possibility is, instead of predicting whether she will pass or fail, you predict the probability that she will pass or fail, given that she has studied so many hours. So instead of exactly studying y, which is 0 and 1, I study probability that y is 1, given she has studied x hours. Let's denote it as small px. Similarly, you can see the probability that she will fail y equal to 0 given x will be nothing but y minus px. So this ratio px to 1 minus px is the odds ratio. That's it's the ratio of pass to ratio of probability of pass to probability of fail. Okay, so this I can call this as the odds ratio. I take the log of odds ratio, log of px by 1 minus px, and I say that this quantity, log of px by 1 minus px, is a linear function of x. Now, this quantity is proportional to x plus some constant beta. Okay. So, and so this transformation px as px by 1 minus px is called a logic function. Logic function. If you do the inverse of this, if you want to express px in, so I have this equation log of px by 1 minus px is beta naught by beta 1 x. I can take the inverse and I can find out that px is nothing but e to the power beta naught plus beta 1 x by 1 plus e to the power beta naught plus beta 1 x. This is the inverse. So basically, I'm taking the inverse of the logic function. I call it the logistic function. Okay. This gives me, so you see this log odds ratio was a linear function of x, but the odds, which is px, is a exponential function or a logistic function. This looks like this, a sigmoid s-shaped function. Note one thing, that this logistic function has some nice properties. As you go to the left to minus infinity, you get its value to be 0. As you go to the right to plus infinity, you get its value to be 1. And everywhere in between, it lies between 0 and 1. So you can use this as a probability. So I can equate it to px. Okay. So now how do I predict my class? I just look at the probabilities. I see, is px greater than 1 minus px? Is it more likely to pass than fail? Then I predict as output as 1. And the other way around, I predict as output to be 0. All right. So I'll just tell you about some alternate notions. Is that sometimes this in machine learning terminology, in statistics terminology, in regression, this beta naught, beta 1 are what which are commonly used. In machine learning terminology, you call beta naught to be b, which is the intercept, and beta 1 to be w, which is the slope of the line. And this logistic function would be represented by a sigma, which is called a sigmoid function. So your output probability y equal to 1 given x, of course, is sigma of wx plus 1 by 1 plus e to the power, this is the sigmoid function, e to the power minus x. Similarly, p of y equal to 0 will be 1 minus this. Okay. So now how do you find, given some training data, how do you find the right value of w and b? You define the error of the model as something called a cross entropy. Cross entropy means you take y, you take the negative of this entire quantity. What is this entire quantity? Y into log of sigma wx plus p, which is nothing but py equal to 1. So y into probability that p that y is equal to 1 plus 1 minus y into probability that y is equal to 0, which is 1 minus probability that y is equal to 1. So y into log of px and 1 minus y into log of 1 minus px. So this is the typical definition of Shannon entropy. Known as gradient descent. You think of this loss, see, this is a function of w and b. So if you plot the value of loss in the z-axis and w and b along the x and y axis, you will get something called a loss surface. For some values of w and b, loss will be less, for some values it will be more. You can visualize it as a surface of the loss value varying with w and b. If you take a gradient, if you take a slope of this surface at any point, say w or b, this is called the gradient of the loss at that point. And what this method, optimization method does, it uses a principle called gradient descent. So you start with a random value of W and B, find the loss, find the gradient of the loss, which I can easily calculate by this expression for gradient, and you change your W and B in the direction of the slope, so that you do a you follow the direction of the highest gradient. So since gradient will point down, your loss will be minimized. If the gradient point down, so your loss will be reduced. You keep on doing this over iterations with the hope that if the function is well behaved, there is only one minima. So keep on doing this. After a good number of times, you will come up with the W and B corresponding to the smallest value of the loss. That's typical gradient descent algorithm. The reason I'm saying this is that a lot of time in training the machine learning algorithms will involve this gradient descent algorithm. And a lot of computational power that we use has to be optimized so that gradient descent is calculated very fast. Okay, so this is about the logistic regression. So now let's come to another very simple method. So the thing is that, okay, why do we bother about all these probabilities and other things? Let's do something. Let's do something very simple. So let's say this is an example. Let's say the x-axis represent how many hours the student have studied, and the y-axis represents what is her IQ. If we can measure IQ, what is her IQ? And then we plot them, and we see that if somebody has studied, well, maybe this is not a good score because somebody with a high IQ, and these plus points represent that somebody with this number of hours studied and this IQ will pass the exam, and the minus point means they will fail the exam. They have failed the exam. So one very simple rule can be something like this. I look at a new student. I find that she has studied so many hours and her IQ is this. What I try to do, I try to find out a bunch of other students who have studied similar number of hours and have similar type of IQs. A mediocre student with this IQ and have studied, say, some 8 hours per day, per week, something like that. And we find out other students, and you see among these other students, we call how many have passed, how many have failed. If majority of them has passed, then the student belongs to pass. That's our prediction will be. If majority of them has failed, this will also be failed. So these similar students, how do I find? Since this is, I have told before that every input can be represented as a vector, as a point, I just find out the distance of this new point to all other points in the tendency, and take k number of points which are closest to this new point x here, uh, according to this distance. So everything lying within this red dotted circle are neighbors, are nearest neighbors of the x point. It's a circle centered at x. And now your value of k, how many neighbors you will take, an integer, may change. It can be 1, it can be 2, it can be 3. So that you have to decide beforehand. And once you have decided that, you can easily take your neighbors. You then take the majority. That's it. Take the majority of them passed, you have passed. You predict to be passed. Okay, so this is what I have told. You take the majority and then predict. So for example, here in this third diagram, 3 nearest neighbor, out of 3 neighbors, 2 have passed, 1 has failed. So the prediction will be pass. Okay, so now as you can see that there are some design choices. There are many configurations of the nearest neighbor classifier, k nearest neighbor classifier you can choose. For example, you can choose different values of k. You can choose how you define your distance metric between 2 data points. Choosing the right value of k is an open problem. If you choose freak kind of thing has failed. Maybe he has got a fever before the exam, even though he has studied and has a high IQ. So there will be one minus point sitting right inside there. So if you take just one neighbor, this noise will give you the wrong prediction. Whereas on the other hand, if you take k to be too large, you basically compare this x point with all the points in the training set. Okay, so you kind of smooth out everything. That's also not good. It's same as saying this in this class, if majority are passed, you will also pass. If few people are failed, you will not fail, and so on. You just take you take everybody's general statistics. That's not good. You have to take local statistics. So this is an open problem. What is the right value of k? One rule of thumb, it's just a rule of thumb. Some theoretical basis is there, but not an absolute surety. Is if you have n number of training points, you take square root of n as k. But this is again a rule of thumb. You have to actually do experiments and see. K is so-called an hyperparameter. Now you have choice of distance metrics. There are many: Euclidean metric, Minkowski, which is mth root of x minus y or r summed over. Manhattan, or the city block distance, is the difference between every coordinate of two vectors and absolute value of the data. So it's like if you move from Euclidean distance is if you move from one point to another, you can go in a straight line. Manhattan distance means it's like a rectangular grid of roads. You can only move along the grid to go from one point to another. There is another interesting distance called the Mahalanobis distance, which is kind of the Euclidean distance, but in Euclidean distance, every coordinate is equally considered. So if you take a point and plot the locus of all points which are at same Euclidean distance, you get a circle. But maybe you want to give more weightage to the x-axis than the y-axis. So you want to kind of take equidistant points as ellipses centered around something. So that would be a Mahalanobis distance. So you scale some dimension more than the other. This is often very common thing that is done. It's called the scale effect or standardization. It's basically you subtract the mean along that direction and divide by the variance along the direction. So this is almost similar to what is called a Mahalanobis distance. You scale with the variation in the direction. Okay, this is one effect which you have to take care by deciding your distance metric. Another effect which is very important is that as the dimensionality grows, the Euclidean metric starts failing. You really don't have meaningful notions of nearest neighbor. So then often you use something called a cosine distance or maybe a correlation. Cosine distance is you think of each of these vectors, you find out the angle between them and take the cosine of that. So if these vectors are aligned in direction, even though their magnitudes may be different, they would have a very low distance. Cosine would be 1. Okay. Another way, if they are orthogonal, they will have the minimum distance. So sometimes in high dimensionality, it is this direction that is more important than the magnitude. Okay, and also this nearest neighbor, because see, you try to think about the process, what you are actually doing is that for every point you are finding out the distance to all other points in the training set. Until and unless you do that, you cannot find, you have to sort that and then find out the nearest neighbor. This is expensive. If your dimension of the data is high, if your training set is large. So how do you do? There are many tricks. One of the common trick is something called an auxiliary data structure or a geometric data structure, where you kind of, it's like a B plus tree or B tree that you use in databases. So what you do, you split up your data point, so by the way, if you look at the dimensions of the input data, the x vector, this is sometimes called the feature space or the input space. So what you do, you partition the input space into blocks like this, using a tree like. So every leaf of the tree would correspond to one such box. And and every node corresponds to a split along one particular dimension. And when you get a new point, you basically can push it down the tree to find out which block it belongs to. How does this help in finding nearest neighbor? Because if you know which block the new point belongs to, you can be almost sure that the k nearest neighbors will be inside this block in which you have pushed down the point. So you do a search, but not over the idea is something like the binary search method you already studied. You take one half of the array and try to search it only in that half. Don't look at any other place in the array. Okay, so you do a linear search only within, let's say, this box B. If my query point or the new point X belongs to this box. Okay, so this actually quickens. There are many other. There is something called a hashing, locally sensitive hashing, LSH, another, which helps you scale up nearest neighbor algorithms. Okay, so we have studied three algorithms so far. We have studied three algorithms so far. We have studied linear regressor. We have studied logistic regressor. We have studied nearest neighbor. There are many more. We could have studied support vector machine, decision tree, other such things. And for the sake of time, I am not doing. If you want, I can share the slides of them. I'll be happy to share. In fact, if you go to my homepage, it is the machine learning course at IIT Kharagpur, and all the slides are available online in PPT form. You can just go through it. Okay, so now that we have so many classifiers, why don't you use all of them and take the voting? So it's not a good practice, but I am still saying that suppose I have there are many doctors who are ready to help me. So I consult each and every, of course, don't do this, just go to one doctor always. So you consult them and kind of take a voting among them, kind of take their joint decision or joint opinion. Okay, so this method is called, so here if I replace these doctors by classifiers, nearest neighbor, decision tree, logistic regression, and for each data point ask each of these classifiers to predict the output, and you kind of take a combined or average output of this, or voting among these outputs. So this method is known as ensemble classifier. By the way, I'm not sure if there are questions. If there are questions, I'll take them at the end of the talk. Okay, so there are many ways how you can construct these members of the ensemble, that is the different classifiers. One common method is you have your training data, you split it up into subsets, S1, S2, Sn. Then train one classifier each for each of these subsets. So you get C1, C2, C1. And then take a combination of them. Combination can be a simple voting, combination can be an average or regression. Let's say C1 tells tomorrow's stock price will be 100 rupees, C2 tells 90 rupees, Cn tells 110 rupees, you take the average. Or let's say in the classification, if C1 tells spam, C2 tells spam, Cn tells non-spam, by vote spam wins, so it is spam. Okay. So now next the question is, how do you construct these multiple data sets out of one data set? So one common method is known as the bootstrapping method. So what bootstrapping does is very simple. It's basically sampling with replacement. So what you do, suppose this is your original set. These balls, these circles represent each data point. You just randomly sample, pick up some of these data points, put them in one set. And after picking them up, you don't remove them from this original data, you replace them with the original data. So it's sampling with replacement. You pick up, but a copy of it still remains in the original data. And you repeat this several times. And so again you do it, again you do it, again you do it. Say some j number of times you do it. So each of these sample will be slightly different from the original sample, Because it is with replacement, maybe something, once one data point may occur multiple number of times in this bootstrap sample. And each of these bootstrap sample will be different from each other. So the basic idea is you have diversity. You are not asking all the classifiers to train on the same data. You are having some diversity. And then each of these bootstrap sample, you train a classifier. It can be any classifier. It can be distance. It can be a logistic regressor. And then finally combine them either by average or by voting, and you get the ensemble classifier. So this method is called the bootstrap. How you create the sample aggregation, bagging. It's called bagging. Okay. So now let us concentrate a little bit on what these classifiers can do. One common choice with bagging, in fact any ensemble classifier, is something called a decision tree. Unfortunately, I don't have enough time to. I can spend actually 2 hours just to discuss how to build a decision tree. But let me quickly go through. Maybe all of you know it also. So it's like a tree where every leaf corresponds to a decision, an output, a prediction. So this and every node corresponds to an input attribute. This is an example where, depending on this is a popular data set available with Kaggle and UCI repository. It's called a Titanic data sets, where a passenger in Titanic is described by the gender, by the age, and how many siblings and spouses of that passenger were also present in Titanic. That is this SIB-SP attribute. And somebody in Titanic survived and some people unfortunately died. So it seems that there is a clear split between, discrimination between who survived depending on these attributes and who did not. So what this tree does is that if we plug in all the attributes of the passenger, it pushes it through the tree and predicts whether that person might have died or not died. Well, this really, you don't predict somebody will die or not die when you board a ship. This is just an illustrative example. Okay, so this is a decision tree, and how do you build the tree? I'm just writing it down. What you do, you follow some kind of editing thing. You first choose an attribute which you kind of nicely separate away in its two branches: the people who survived and people who do not survive. You have two classes, died and survived. It will separate out the classes best way possible using a single attribute. Now you go to each branch. If they are pure, that means everybody who has followed this branch, whose gender was female and survived, and it's called a pure leaf. You don't break it down further. If it is not, you consider other attributes. It's like a doctor doing the diagnosis. Okay, so you have to decide whether you have COVID or not. Decide you have the COVID or not. So what you are supposed to do, first you look at whether you have cough or not, or whether you have temperature or not. If you have temperature, maybe surely you have COVID, so don't split it. If you don't have temperature, maybe you look at other things, you look at you are coughing or not. If you are coughing, then you look at, if you are coughing, maybe you definitely have COVID. If you are not coughing, maybe look at something else. What is your oxygen saturation? Then you look at that and then you find that. So this is typically how a doctor takes a decision. Okay, so how this is built, the way doctor looks at the order in which you examine the attributes. First, you look at the attribute which they nicely categorizes COVID patients into that COVID or not COVID. Then, among those which are not so certain, see which is the next most discriminating attribute. You measure discrimination by something called a information gain or difference in income. Okay, so this is how a tree is built. Sometimes you stop building the tree at certain level because you don't want a very deep tree. You allow for some error in the prediction. Sometimes what you can do, is that you can sort of restrict this process of building the tree. Okay, restrict this process of building the tree. How will you restrict? Because see, what you are doing at every level among the remaining attributes, you are picking up, say there you have 1,000 attributes. So among 1,000 you are picking the best. Then among 999 you are picking up the best to split. Then among 998 you are picking up the best to split. You are doing this kind of greedy search. To make things simpler, what you do is at every step, I don't consider which one is the best among all 999. I randomly pick up, let's say 3 or 4 or 5 among these 999. Any random three of randomly I pick up age and say CBSP. I randomly pick up 3 among 999. And among these 3, you see which is the best one to split and use it. And do that as every step. So this is kind of a restricted decision tree or a simplified decision tree. So what you do in a very popular algorithm called random forest. What you do, you build a bootstrap sample like this. You build a bootstrap sample. And then on each of these bootstrap sample, you build this simplified trees, where at every stage we consider only a small subset of the original, random small subset of the original, and you pick the best amount. Okay, and you get a ensemble of trees. Now you get a new instance. You push it down each of the tree, find out the leaves, decision, class level output, and take a majority. Take a majority to get the pointers. So the bootstrapping does a randomization on the rows of your data table, on the points training points, and your randomization in the building the tree does a randomization on the columns of the data table, the attributes. So you have a by two-way randomization. Often it is found that because you are finally doing the averaging, this randomization brings in a lot of diversity. See, when you consider the voting among many users, many classifiers, it's good if the classifiers are different from each other. If everybody is same, then voting doesn't help. They are not giving diversity. If you have a diversity, then only voting helps. Okay, so there is this is called a bagging. Does not come. Anyway, let me. Okay, there is an alternate to this. So here, what I have done, each of these. So the principle is same. You split your data into groups, and then on each group, each bootstrap sample, you train your classifier. But you see, in bagging, each of these samples can be drawn independently of the other. You don't have to wait for this sampling to complete to build this sample. This is an advantage. Of course, you can parallelize it. You can use your GPU architecture. You can have different threads for each of these bootstrap samples, and they can run concurrently. But sometimes there is a dependency. That means you build a bootstrap sample, you train a classifier, say the first classifier on the left, you identify its inadequacies. You see that what are the points in which this classifier is failing, it's misclassified. And then you try to sort of make up for that. You try to compensate for the inadequacy of the first classifier from the second, using the second classifier. How do you do that? You build the second bootstrap sample consisting mainly of the points which are not correctly classified by the first classifier. Okay, those points you use, and ask classifier 2 to focus on those points so that it gives good performance on those points. Okay, and so on. What are the inadequacies of the second classifier is taken care of by the third classifier. Accordingly, sample is built. So it's very easy to build a sample. What you do is that consider the points misclassified by classifier 2, have them in more numbers in the third bootstrap. It's no longer a bootstrap, it's the third boosted sample. You boost the points which are misclassified so that there are more in number in the sample. Build a classifier and so on, and finally take an average. And you don't take a direct average. What you do, you take a weighted average. The classifiers which did not have to be compensated much, which are already good, their weightage in the voting should be more. They should vote more in the weightage. Okay, so you give more weightage to their distance. Okay, so this is boosting. This is the mathematics, how you calculate the probability of being in the next sample, how you take the classifier combination. This alpha m decides the weight of each classifier, how much. It's basically the ratio of not making an error to making an error and log of that. Okay. So this bootstrap, this algorithm is called the Adaboost algorithm. It's a very popular algorithm in this. So what this Adaboost does is that it's kind of sequential. Right? It takes one, and so that's actually not very good for parallelization, for fast calculation. But you see that this has something of a property called forward stage-wise adaptive modeling. That means at every step you build a sequence of classifiers. In the bagging case, this is not really sequence; they can be independent. In the ensemble. In the boosting, the next one in the sequence depends on the previous. This is called a forward step, and then finally you add them up. You kind of combine them. So you minimize a loss function which consists of the loss of the previous classifier plus the current classifier. Okay, so this is sometimes called FSM. This technology method. Finally, everything is added up. These are additive modeling. This principle is kind of used to something called a gradient boosting. So gradient boosting is very simple. The fundamental observation is that if you have an error function of this form, say y minus fx whole square, you have an error function y minus fx whole square. Let's say I put an half in the beginning, so that it's half of y minus fx whole square. If we take the derivative of this error with respect to fx, what do I get? I get minus of y minus fx. And what is y minus fx? If you remember the first slide, it was the residual epsilon. It's the residual epsilon. So the gradient, and what is del of error by del of fx? It's nothing but a gradient of the error with respect to the model. So you can see the gradient of the error with respect to the model is nothing but negative of the residual. So residual is negative of gradient. Residual is negative of gradient. This is what. This gives me a weight update proof. So, in gradient descent, actually, as I mentioned, you take a step in the steepest gradient direction. This can be written in a very simple form like this. So, your new function, new classifier P is your old classifier minus this symbol is for the gradient of the error, which is j of y and fxi is the gradient. And fx minus the gradient would be the new classifier by taking a step along the direction of the gradient. Usually we don't take a large step, we take a step which is weighted by something called an eta, a learning rate. So it depends. See, you are taking a gradient step, but how much? Is it same as the gradient? No, you don't take same as the gradient. If you take two large steps, you might not converge. So you take a small step. You take a step which is eta times the gradient, where eta is a learning rate, maybe say 0.1, 0.01, something like that. So this is the typical gradient descent update. And you have already seen that gradient is nothing. This del of j is nothing. Del of j with del of fx is nothing negative of the residual. So this is what is done. Let me qualitatively explain what it means. Let me qualitatively explain this math. You can go through later. See, the idea is like this. So suppose I want to predict, let's say, the stock value of a stock tomorrow. So the simplest thing I do, I say what has been the average value of the stock so far, and I predict tomorrow's value be same as that average value. Okay, and this is my simplest prediction algorithm. And then I look at the residual. That is the difference between the actual value of the stock tomorrow and this average value. That I call as a residual. Now I design another predictor. Let's say another decision tree, which will try to predict not the stock value directly, but the value of this residual. Okay, so initially I say y is m1 xi plus epsilon, and the residual is this yi minus m1 xi. And then I have another model which tries to predict this residual itself, ei1. ei1 is m2 xi plus the second order residual epsilon 2. Okay. And then how do I use this? Very simple, because the first classifier is predicting some proved value, second classifier is predicting a residual, the third classifier is predicting the residual of the residual, the fourth the residual of the residual of the residual. So if I add up all this, so I add up the crude prediction, then a small correction to it, then a small correction on the correction, then a small correction on the correction on the correction. If I go on adding them, I get a nice ensemble classifier. Okay, so this is basically, so I'm not going to the mathematics, it can be done. I can explain it in terms of classification also. Let's say these boxes and circles are two sets of points. Okay, the first classifier, iteration 1, draws a vertical line. Anything to the left of the line it says as a circle, right of the line boxes. So you see these red circles are one which are misclassified. Okay, this is the residual. These red ones are the residual. Now I have M2, which is, I keep the first one, this horizontal line, and I add another line, which is the second one, second classifier. This says anything below this is among the residuals, anything below this is square, above this is circle. So you see this blue box, blue small square is the second level residual. Okay, so I need a third classifier. This explains the third level classifier. And if I take the addition of all these three, I'll get my nice ensemble classifier. So this is called gradient boosting. These are the steps. I'll go through this. Okay, so if you remember, I mentioned that sometimes while building a tree, I don't just consider the leaves should correctly, I also consider the height of the tree, the size of the tree. This is called a regularization or a model size. So this is often, it can be anything. So I represent it by this omega h. So this is called a regularization term. So if you build your tree using the usual error plus this regularization term, is called a regularized tree. So each of these trees, if I do by this regularization process and get the final example, the final model, ensemble model, that would be called a extreme gradient boosting. Gradient boosting plus regularization, sometimes called the XGBoost algorithm. This has become one of the most popular algorithms. This is very fast because, as you can see, you can easily parallelize it. Okay. Now let me quickly come to the last thing, which is an example of unsupervised learning, which is clustering. You want to form groups of data, exploratory analysis. Your goal is to minimize intra-cluster distance and maximize inter-cluster distance. This is simple. And there are actually two types of clustering algorithm. Not two, there are some more also. One is partitional clustering. That means you just partition the data into groups. Another is hierarchical. You kind of form a dendrogram where it's like a minimal spanning tree. You group the objects, then merge them. You go through a merging process. And if you cut this tree at any level, you get groups which are clusters. Let's discuss one simple partitional algorithm called the K-means clustering. What you do is very simple. What you do is that if you want k number of clusters, if you want say 3 clusters, you arbitrarily choose 3 points as cluster seeds or cluster centers. Now all the other points you divide them into groups depending on which cluster center it is closest to. So all these brown points are closest to this cluster center, all these green points are closest to this cluster center, all these blue points are closest to this third. I have marked the cluster center by crosses. Okay, so this is the first approximate clustering, a starting cluster. Then what I do, I update this cluster center from my initial guess. Initially, I randomly picked up, that's kind of my guess of the cluster centers. I update, how I update? All these brown points are closest to the first cluster center. I take the centroid of this, all these brown points as my new cluster center. So my original cluster center will move a bit. Similarly for this green point, similarly for this blue point. Now again repeat. All the points which are closest to this cross are now brown, closest to this cross are now green, closest to this cross are now blue. So you see they have moved. Now again take the center of all these blue points, center of all these green points, center of this brown point. So you see the seeds will again move. If you keep on doing it by few number of iterations, you will see now you have nice separated high intercluster, low intercluster distances. And the seeds are now sitting inside the cluster. This is my final cluster. This is what, and if over two successive iterations, the seeds do not move much, the centroids do not move much, I say I have converged. So that's my final output. Okay, so this is an example. There are other algorithms. There is DBScan, which uses a notion of connected components. If one point is connected, if there is a kind of a bridge between them, there is a dense set of points between them, we can define other systems. But this is the most popular. Of course, you have to choose the value of k, and you have to choose your initial cluster. Your results depend on it. Okay. So with this, I think I end. Most of my talks material is taken from these two books. It's a book on data mining by Tan Steinbach and Bipin Kumar. And this is a little more mathematically involved book, Introduction to Statistical Learning by Hasti, Tipsinani, Witten, and James. These two are gem of a book. This is more procedural, whereas this is more theoretical. Okay. So with this, I end my talk.